Horror has never been static. It shifts, it adapts, and it absorbs the anxieties of the time and reshapes them into something visible, something tangible. What the audiences fear, it's never random. It's rooted in culture, in uncertainty, and the quiet tension that lies beneath everyday life. Horror films, they don't invent that tension. They just reveal it. And as society changes, so do the monsters. Early horror cinema, it relied on atmosphere rather than explicit violence. It favored suggestion over spectacle, allowing fear to emerge through tone, pacing, and implication. Figures like Dracula, they embodied more than predation. He represented intrusion, disease, and the unsettling idea of exerting influence over other people without force. His presence suggested that danger could be invited in, rather than being imposed upon you. The Wolfman, it explored a different fear, the loss of control. The transformation, it wasn't just physical. It symbolized an instability within human nature itself. And Frankenstein's monster, it carried yet another layer. He wasn't inherently malicious, he was just abandoned. His existence, it raised questions about scientific responsibility and the consequences of unchecked ambitions. And ghosts too, they reflected something quieter. Memory, guilt, and unresolved pasts. They weren't always threats, but rather reminders that our history will haunt us. This era established horror as a reflective genre, one grounded in metaphor rather than excess. And with the introduction of the Hays Code in the 1930s, horror faced very strict limitations. Violence had to be restrained, moral clarity was enforced, and evil couldn't triumph in any lasting way. As a result, filmmakers shifted their approach. Rather than showing horror directly, they implied it. Shadows replaced spectacle, and silence replaced explicit horror. And these restrictions, they shaped the genre in a paradoxical way. While it limited expression, it also intensified psychological tensions. Audiences, they were left to imagine what they couldn't be shown. However, the genre still felt contained, and its darker potential was suppressed beneath enforced boundaries. By the 1960s, those boundaries, they began to erode. And films like Psycho marked a turning point. The threat wasn't supernatural or distant, it was human, and it was standing behind the desk that was in front of you. Norman Bates, he introduced a new kind of fear. The ordinary individual who was capable of extraordinary violence. This shift grounded horror in reality, making it more immediate and more unsettling. And the genre, it began moving away from external monsters and more towards internal instability. Night of the Living Dead, it redefined horror entirely. Its depiction of zombies transformed them into symbols of societal breakdown. These were not controlled creations or mystical beings, they were the results of an unexplained and unstoppable force. Even the film's bleak tone reflected widespread uncertainty at the time. Systems failed, communication collapsed, and survival, it became fragmented and temporary. Importantly, the horror extended beyond the undead. There was human conflict, mistrust, and panic, it proved equally as dangerous. This marked a shift towards realism and pessimism within the genre. And the 1970s marked a harsher, more grounded form of horror. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, it presented violence in a way that felt unfiltered and immediate. Its lack of polish contributed to a sense of authenticity, as though the audience were witnessing something that they shouldn't be. John Carpenter's Halloween, it simplified horror into a nearly abstract form. Michael Myers functioned less as a character and more as a presence, silent, emotionless, and persistent. And Friday the 13th extended this approach, using isolation as a central element. These remote locations removed the possibility of intervention, intensifying the vulnerability of the protagonist. Meanwhile, The Evil Dead, it introduced a chaotic and aggressive energy. Possession was no longer subtle or symbolic like it was in The Exorcist. It became invasive and relentless. This decade emphasized vulnerability, unpredictability, and the erosion of public safety. And during this period, the role of the protagonist evolved as well. The emergence of the final girl reflected a shift towards resilience. Rather than passive victims, survivors became active participants in their own escape. This change mirrored broader cultural conversations about independence and endurance. Survival, it no longer felt incidental, it was earned. And the 1980s, like everything else, expanded in both scale and intensity. A Nightmare on Elm Street introduced a concept that blurred reality and dreams. Freddy Krueger, he represented an inescapable threat, one that existed within the mind itself. The Friday the 13th series transformed its antagonist into a near mythical, unkillable creature, emphasizing endurance over realism. And Hellraiser explored darker philosophical and visual territory, with antagonists who explore the depths of both torture and ecstasy. During this time, horror also became commercially reliable. Lower production costs, combined with strong audience turnout, made it a profitable genre, encouraging experimentation and franchise development. Meanwhile, films like Alien and Predator merged horror with science fiction. These narratives, they placed characters in environments where they lacked any sense of control. Space, the wilderness, unfamiliar terrain. The threats were no longer supernatural in a traditional sense. They were biological, strategic, and often superior to us. This shift reflected anxieties about technology, exploration, and humanity's place in a much larger and unknown system called the universe. And by the 1990s, horror had become increasingly self-aware. Scream popped onto the scene and acknowledged established tropes while simultaneously using them. This meta approach allowed for the genre to evolve without abandoning its foundations entirely. And at the same time, films like Jacob's Ladder explored psychological fragmentation. And the turn of the century introduced new intensity to the genre. 28 Days Later reimagined zombies as brutal, fast-moving carriers of infection. The emphasis shifted from crawling decay to immediacy, reflecting fears of rapid societal collapse. Saw focused on moral consequences, structuring violence around choice and accountability. These films emphasized control, or the lack of it. Then comes Paranormal Activity, demonstrating the effectiveness of minimalism. By limiting scale and focusing on familiar environments, it created a sense of realism that heightened its tension. The supernatural returned, but in a more intimate form, embedded within everyday life. The Purge shifted focus towards society itself. Its premise, sanctioned violence within a controlled time frame, it highlighted underlying tensions within civilization. It turns out the horror wasn't external, it was systemic. This reflected growing concerns about punishment, government influence, inequality, and the fragility of order. Contemporary horror has increasingly incorporated societal analysis. Get Out, Us, and Nope, they all demonstrate this shift. These narratives combine psychological tension with commentary on identity, perception, and power. Fear becomes layered, not just immediate, but conceptual. Horror, it evolves into a medium capable of both unsettling and examining the structures that produce that unease. And across decades, one pattern remains clear. Monsters evolve alongside us. Slashers transition from human killers to near unstoppable symbolic forces. Possession becomes less religious and more invasive, and eventually, the distinction between monster and human being begins to dissolve entirely. It's no longer chasing us, it's waiting for us in the mirror. But horror persists because it serves a function. It externalizes our fears. It allows audiences to confront uncertainty within a controlled environment. It transforms our abstract anxieties into a narrative form. And in doing so, it provides a sense of understanding, however temporary it is. People are worried that horror didn't just reflect darkness, it created it. But that fear, it says a lot more about society than the films themselves. Because I don't know if you know this, but horror has always been a mirror. When people see something disturbing in it, they're often recognizing something that was already there. And over time, the monster changed again. It became less defined, and sometimes it wasn't a creature at all. It was grief, isolation, addiction, and identity. Modern horror often strips away traditional villains and replaces them with emotional realities. The fear isn't just dying, it's living with something unbearable. Protagonists aren't just survivors or fighters anymore, they're witnesses. They're participants in stories where victory isn't always guaranteed, or even possible. So why do we keep watching? Why do we return to these stories again and again? It's because horror does something that no other genre can do. It confronts us. It actually forces us to sit with our discomfort, to face the things that we would rather ignore. It gives shape to abstract fears, and sometimes it even helps us understand them. It helps us understand that the monster isn't just something to defeat, it's something we can recognize. And horror will continue to evolve, because fear will always continue to evolve. New technologies, new tensions, new uncertainties, all of them will shape what horror monster comes next. But the foundation, that remains unchanged. Because when something feels wrong, when something lingers just underneath the surface, lurking just out of sight, horror, it will always find a way to bring that into the light. Thank you for making it to the end of this video. So tell me, what's your favorite horror movie, and who do you think is the scariest villain in all of fiction? Or, if you have any ideas for videos that you want to see in the future, drop them down below. We may just talk about it. Peace.